A very tall African man standing in the middle of old Japan, his dark skin shining with sweat as he holds a katana sword. Around him, hundreds of Japanese people stare in total shock. Many have never seen anyone who looks like him. Some think he's a demon, others think he's a god. But the most powerful war leader in Japan sees something completely different. A warrior. This is the story of Yasuke. The man who went from being a slave to becoming a samurai, who stood next to legends, and whose name has been left out of most history books until now. The year is 1579. Japan is filled with blood and violence. For over 100 years, the country has been locked in the Sengoku period, the time of warring states. War leaders called daimyo fight without stopping for control. Villages burn, armies fight. The emperor exists only in name. Real power belongs to those strong enough to take it. Into this chaos sails an Italian Jesuit missionary named Alessandro Valignano. He's come to spread Christianity, to build churches, to save souls. But he brings something far more controversial than religion. He brings Yasuke. We don't know Yasuke's real name. We don't know exactly where in Africa he was born, though most historians believe he came from Mozambique or Ethiopia. Or we know he was likely captured, sold into slavery, and eventually became a servant to Valignano. We know he was incredibly tall, standing around 6 feet 2 inches when the average Japanese man was barely 5 feet tall. We know his skin was so dark that when he first arrived in Japan, people literally couldn't believe their eyes. But here's what makes this moment fascinating. Yasuke wasn't being hidden, he was being paraded. Valignano understood spectacle. He knew that bringing someone so physically different would attract attention. And attention meant audiences. Audiences meant opportunities to preach. So Yasuke walked through Japanese cities like a living advertisement, crowds gathering wherever he went. On March 27, 1581, they arrived in Kyoto, the imperial capital. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. Thousands of people rushed to see this mysterious foreigner. The crowds grew so large, so wild, that people were crushed in the chaos. Some died in the stampede just trying to catch a glimpse of him. The Jesuits had to be rescued by soldiers and taken to a local temple for safety. But someone else had heard about the commotion. Someone who didn't just want to see Yasuke from a distance. He wanted to meet him face to face. His name was Oda Nobunaga, and he was the most dangerous man in Japan. Let me tell you who Oda Nobunaga was, because understanding him is essential to understanding Yasuke's story. And Nobunaga was a military genius and an absolute revolutionary. While other daimyo held on to tradition, Nobunaga embraced innovation. He was one of the first Japanese commanders to use firearms on a massive scale. He promoted people based on skill, not birthright. He built roads, destroyed toll barriers, and encouraged free trade. He was brutal when he needed to be, burning temples, crushing rebellions, destroying anyone who opposed him. But he was also curious, open-minded, and fascinated by foreign culture. By 1581, Nobunaga had unified nearly half of Japan under his control. He was within striking distance of ending the warring states period and becoming the undisputed ruler of the entire nation. He surrounded himself with the best warriors, the sharpest minds, the most loyal servants. But even Nobunaga had never seen anyone like Yasuke. When Nobunaga heard about the enormous black man causing riots in Kyoto, he immediately summoned Valignano to his castle in Azuchi. This wasn't a request. This was an order from the most powerful warlord in the land. Valignano came and he brought Yasuke with him. The moment Nobunaga saw Yasuke, he was fascinated. According to Jesuit records, Nobunaga refused to believe that Yasuke's skin was naturally black. He thought it was ink or dye. So he ordered Yasuke to strip to the waist and wash himself, convinced the color would come off. It didn't, of course. Nobunaga's fascination only deepened. He spent hours talking with Yasuke through interpreters, asking him about Africa, about his life, about his journey. And something remarkable happened during those conversations. Nobunaga saw potential. Because, here's the thing, Yasuke wasn't just tall and strong. He was intelligent. He was adaptable. He had survived slavery, survived being torn from his homeland, survived the brutal journey across the world. He had learned languages, learned customs, learned how to exist in completely foreign environments. Those weren't the traits of a simple servant. Those were the traits of a survivor, and survivors could be turned into warriors. Within weeks, Nobunaga made a decision that shocked everyone in his court. He freed Yasuke from service to the Jesuits. He gave him a house. He gave him a salary. He gave him servants of his own. And then, in an act that broke every social rule of feudal Japan, he began training Yasuke in the ways of the samurai. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Because Nobunaga didn't just train Yasuke. He made him one of his personal servants, his weapons bearer, his bodyguard, his constant companion. Yasuke was given the honor of carrying Nobunaga's sword, a position reserved only for the most trusted warriors. He was allowed into private meetings, into strategy sessions, into the inner circle of power. In less than a year, a man who had been a slave became a member of the samurai class. Now, let's pause here because this raises a crucial question. Was Yasuke actually a samurai? This debate has raged among historians for decades. And it matters because the samurai weren't just warriors. They were a social class with specific privileges, responsibilities, and honor codes. To be samurai meant something. It meant status, land, authority. Here's what we know for certain. Yasuke was given a katana and a wakizashi, the two swords that were the symbols of samurai rank. In feudal Japan, carrying these weapons was legally restricted to the samurai class. Anyone else caught with them could be executed on the spot. Yasuke carried them openly with Nobunaga's approval. Yasuke was given a salary and property. Again, hallmarks of samurai status. Common soldiers and servants didn't receive these benefits. Yasuke fought in actual battles alongside Nobunaga's other retainers. He wasn't decorative. He wasn't ceremonial. He was operational. And most tellingly, contemporary Japanese sources, written by people who actually lived during this period, referred to Yasuke using terms associated with samurai rank. The most famous record comes from Chronicles of Lord Nobunaga, written by Nobunaga's retainer, Ota Gyuichi. In this chronicle, Yasuke is described with respect as someone who held position and responsibility in Nobunaga's household. But here's the complex part. But Yasuke's exact status remains unclear because the formal samurai structure was incredibly rigid and exceptions were rare. Some historians argue he was a full samurai. Others argue he occupied a unique middle ground, honored retainer and warrior, but perhaps not technically samurai in the strictest sense. What's undeniable is this. Yasuke went from enslaved servant to trusted warrior in one of the most class-conscious societies in human history. That alone is extraordinary. So, what was life like for Yasuke during this period? By all accounts, fascinating and surreal. He lived in Azuki Castle, one of the most magnificent structures in Japan, a 7-story fortress covered in gold leaf and paintings towering over Lake Biwa. He attended Nobunaga at tea ceremonies, at no-theater performances, and at military councils. He learned Japanese language and customs at a rapid pace, and he became something of a celebrity. People traveled from distant provinces just to see the Black Samurai. Children followed him through castle towns. Artists painted him. Poets wrote about him. He was an object of endless curiosity and gradual respect. But Yasuke's life wasn't all ceremony and spectacle. Nobunaga was still conquering Japan, which meant Yasuke was going to war. In 1581, Yasuke accompanied Nobunaga on a military campaign against the Takeda clan in central Japan. This wasn't a small skirmish. It was a major offensive involving thousands of troops. Yasuke was there fighting alongside elite samurai warriors, experiencing the brutal reality of feudal Japanese warfare. Imagine what that must have been like. The clash of steel, the thunder of war drums, the screams of dying men. Yasuke wielding weapons that months earlier he wouldn't have been allowed to touch, standing in formation with warriors who had trained their entire lives for this moment. He survived. More than that, he distinguished himself. Contemporary accounts suggest that Yasuke was physically formidable in combat. His height and strength, which had made him a curiosity, now made him dangerous. In close quarters, fighting with swords and spears, reach and power mattered enormously. Yasuke had both. For the next year, Yasuke's star continued to rise. He became more than just Nobunaga's bodyguard. He became a symbol of Nobunaga's unconventional genius, his willingness to break with tradition and find value where others saw only the strange and foreign. But in feudal Japan, success bred enemies, and those enemies were watching, waiting for their moment. That moment came on June 21st, 582, at a place called Honnoji, and it came from the person Nobunaga least expected. To understand what happened at Honnoji, you need to understand that Nobunaga had created as many enemies as he had conquered territories. He had burned Buddhist temples and slaughtered monks who opposed him. He had humiliated rival daimyo, forcing them into submission. He ruled with a mixture of brilliance and brutality that made him effective, but also deeply feared. Even among his own generals, there was resentment buried beneath layers of loyalty and obligation. One of those generals was a man named Akechi Mitsuhide. Mitsuhide was skilled, intelligent, and had served Nobunaga faithfully for years. He had led armies to victory, administered provinces, done everything asked of him. But there's evidence that Nobunaga had publicly humiliated him on multiple occasions, mocking him in front of other retainers, questioning his competence, and treating him with casual cruelty. In feudal Japan, honor was everything, and Nobunaga had wounded Mitsuhide's honor repeatedly. In June 582, Nobunaga was traveling from his castle at Azuki to assist Toyotomi Hideyoshi, another of his generals, in a campaign against the Mori clan in western Japan. Along the way, Nobunaga stopped in Kyoto to rest at Honnoji, a Buddhist temple that had been converted into a temporary lodging. Nobunaga was traveling light. He had only a small force with him, about 30 retainers and guards. He was deep in territory he controlled, surrounded by allies. He had no reason to expect danger. Yasuke was with him. Meanwhile, Akechi Mitsuhide had been ordered to march his army west to reinforce Hideyoshi. Instead, on the night of June 20th, Mitsuhide made a decision that would change Japanese history. He turned his army around and marched toward Kyoto. He was going to kill Nobunaga. At dawn on June 21st, Mitsuhide's forces, numbering around 13,000 troops, surrounded Honnoji. Nobunaga was still sleeping. So was most of his retinue. Mitsuhide's soldiers stormed the temple from all sides, setting fires, cutting down anyone who resisted. Inside the temple, chaos erupted. Nobunaga woke to the sound of battle. For a brief moment, he thought it was a rebellion by local peasants or rival monks. But when he saw the banners of his own general flying outside, he understood immediately. This was betrayal. Nobunaga had survived dozens of battles, dozens of assassination attempts. He was too experienced, too cunning to be caught off guard like this. Except he had been, and now he was trapped. According to historical records, Nobunaga fought. Of course, he fought. This was a man who had built an empire through warfare and willpower. He grabbed a bow and began shooting arrows at the attacking soldiers. He killed several before the bow broke. Then he took up a spear and fought in close combat, even as the temple burned around him. But it was hopeless. Mitsuhide's forces were overwhelming. Nobunaga's tiny retinue was being cut down. The flames were spreading. There was no escape. And through all of this, Yasuke was fighting beside him. We don't have detailed accounts of exactly what Yasuke did during those desperate minutes, but we know he was there. We know he survived the initial assault. We know he fought with Nobunaga until the very end. But here's where the story becomes almost mythological in its tragedy. When Nobunaga realized the battle was lost, he retreated into the inner chambers of the temple. And there, with the flames closing in and enemies at the door, he performed seppuku, ritual suicide. Rather than be captured and humiliated by a traitor, he chose to die on his own terms. Yasuke was one of the last people to see Nobunaga alive. After Nobunaga's death, Yasuke could have fled. He could have tried to escape in the chaos. Instead, he gathered the surviving retainers and fought his way to nearby Nijo Castle, where Nobunaga's son and heir, Oda Nobutada, was staying. This is important. This wasn't just loyalty, this was strategic thinking. The Oda clan's survival depended on protecting Nobutada. If he could be saved, the rebellion could be crushed, and Nobunaga's legacy could be preserved. Yasuke and the other retainers reached Nijo Castle and prepared for a last stand. But Mitsuhide wasn't finished. His army followed them, surrounded the castle, and launched a second assault. Once again, Yasuke fought. Once again, he was vastly outnumbered. And once again, the battle was hopeless. Nobutada, like his father, chose seppuku rather than capture. One by one, Nobunaga's retainers were killed or forced to surrender until only Yasuke remained fighting. Think about that for a moment. A man who had been enslaved less than 2 years earlier, who had been brought to Japan as a curiosity, who had no blood ties to Japanese nobility, no ancestral obligations. That man fought to the last to defend his lord's family. That's not just duty, that's honor. Finally, overwhelmed and exhausted, Yasuke was captured. Mitsuhide's soldiers brought him before the general. Br. Kamer. And here's where Yasuke's story takes its strangest turn. Because Akeki Mitsuhide, the man who had just killed the most powerful warlord in Japan, made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. When Yasuke was brought before Akeki Mitsuhide, still covered in blood from the battle, Mitsuhide had every reason to execute him. Yasuke had fought against him. Yasuke had been one of Nobunaga's most visible retainers. Killing him would have been both strategic, eliminating a potential rallying point for Nobunaga's loyalists, and symbolic. But Mitsuhide didn't kill him. According to the Jesuit records written by Louis Frau, a missionary who chronicled events in Japan during this period, Mitsuhide declared that Yasuke was not Japanese and therefore knew nothing. He ordered that Yasuke be returned to the Jesuits. This decision is fascinating for several reasons. First, it suggests that despite everything Yasuke had accomplished, despite fighting alongside samurai, despite being honored by Nobunaga, Mitsuhide still saw him fundamentally as an outsider. Not quite a real retainer, not quite worthy of the honorable death that samurai deserved. There's racism in that decision, obviously, but there's also something else, a kind of mercy, or perhaps contempt disguised as mercy. By declaring Yasuke didn't know anything, Mitsuhide was essentially saying he wasn't responsible for his actions. He was just a foreigner who had been caught up in Japanese affairs he couldn't understand. It's a complicated moment because, on one hand, it saved Yasuke's life. On the other hand, it denied him the recognition he had earned through blood and loyalty. But here's what makes this even more intriguing. We don't know if Yasuke accepted that mercy gratefully or with rage. Was he relieved to be spared, or was he insulted to be dismissed? Did he want to die with honor alongside the men he'd fought beside? Or did survival matter more than honor? People of war for will never know, because after Yasuke was returned to the Jesuits, he vanished from historical records completely. One of the most remarkable figures in feudal Japanese history. A man who went from enslaved servant to samurai warrior in less than 2 years, simply disappears from the historical record in June 5082. We don't know if he stayed in Japan. We don't know if he returned to Africa or went somewhere else entirely. We don't know if he lived a long life or died shortly after. We don't know if he ever picked up a sword again, or if he spent his remaining years trying to forget the blood and fire of Honnoji. All we have is silence. But let's talk about what happened to the other players in this drama, because their fates are known and they're instructive. Akechi Mitsuhide, the traitor who killed Nobunaga, didn't enjoy his victory for long. His rebellion lasted exactly 13 days before he was hunted down and killed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's other general, who would eventually unify Japan himself. Mitsuhide's reign is remembered as the 13-day shogunate, a humiliating footnote in history. The Oda clan was thrown into chaos. Without Nobunaga's genius to guide them, his sons and generals fought amongst themselves for control. Eventually, Hideyoshi emerged victorious and completed Nobunaga's work of unification. Then Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan for over 250 years. Japan entered a period of peace and isolation. Foreigners were expelled, Christianity was banned, the samurai class became more rigid, more defined, more exclusive. The kind of social mobility that had allowed Yasuke to rise became essentially impossible. In other words, the world that had briefly made room for an African samurai closed, shut, perhaps forever. And Yasuke, he became a ghost story, a legend, a footnote in the chronicles of greater men until recently. Because in the last few decades, something remarkable has happened. Yasuke has been rediscovered, and his story has taken on new life in ways no one could have predicted. For centuries, Yasuke existed only in obscure Japanese historical texts and Jesuit records that few people read. Occasionally, a historian would mention him in passing. Oh yes, there was an African retainer in Nobunaga, but he wasn't considered important enough to warrant serious study. That started to change in the 20th century as scholars began looking more critically at the diversity of historical experience. Researchers started asking questions like, who were the foreigners in feudal Japan? How did they fit into Japanese society? What were their stories? And Yasuke's story, when examined closely, was extraordinary. In 2019, a children's book called The Boy Who Became a Samurai helped introduce Yasuke to young readers. Then, novels, graphic novels, and historical analyses began appearing. In 2021, Netflix released an anime series called Yasuke that reimagined his story with fantasy elements. In 2024, he was featured as a character in the video game Assassin's Creed Shadows. Suddenly, this forgotten figure was everywhere. But here's what's interesting about Yasuke's modern rediscovery. People are arguing about him intensely. Some people celebrate his story as proof that feudal Japan was more diverse and complex than we usually imagine. They point out that while rare, foreigners did exist in pre-isolation Japan, and some of them achieved remarkable things. Others argue that Yasuke is being overhyped, that he was an interesting historical curiosity but not truly significant, and that modern media is exaggerating his importance for contemporary political reasons. Some Japanese historians have pushed back against Western portrayals of Yasuke, arguing that foreigners don't understand the nuances of samurai culture and are projecting modern values onto a historical figure who existed in a completely different context. And then there are the race debates, because Yasuke's story unavoidably raises questions about representation, about who gets remembered, and why, about how African history has been systematically erased or marginalized. All of this controversy, all of this debate, it's happening because people care. Because Yasuke's story touches something raw and relevant, even 440 years after his disappearance. But let's step back from modern debates and ask a more fundamental question. What does Yasuke's story actually tell us? I think it tells us several things. First, it reminds us that history is stranger and more diverse than we usually imagine. We tend to think of feudal Japan as hermetically sealed, as ethnically homogeneous, as rigidly traditional. And in many ways, it was. But it also had moments of extraordinary openness. Moments when the right combination of circumstances could allow someone completely outside the system to enter it. Second, it shows us something profound about human adaptability. Yasuke survived being enslaved, survived being torn from his homeland, survived being displayed as a spectacle, and then when given the slightest opportunity, he transformed himself into something else entirely. That's resilience on a level most of us can barely imagine. Third, it reveals something about what it means to belong. Yasuke had no Japanese blood. He had no ancestral ties to the samurai class. He had no claim to honor by birth. But he claimed it through action, through loyalty, through courage. He made himself belong through sheer force of will and character. And finally, Yasuke's story reminds us how fragile historical memory is. If not for a few scattered records kept by Jesuit missionaries and Japanese chroniclers, we would never have known he existed. How many other remarkable people have been completely erased from history? How many stories are lost forever because no one thought to write them down? Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. We don't actually know how Yasuke's story ends. Did he die in Japan, unknown and forgotten? Did he make it back to Africa somehow? Did he find peace? Did he spend his final years haunted by the memories of Onoji, by the image of Nobunaga dying in flames, by the faces of the men he killed? Or did he find a way to make a new life, to integrate himself so completely into Japanese society that his foreignness became unremarkable? We simply don't know. The historical record falls silent, and in that silence, we're left to imagine. But here's what we do know. For at least 1 year, from 1581 to 1582, a man who had been enslaved stood as an equal among the warrior elite of feudal Japan. He carried swords reserved for samurai. He fought in battles that shaped Japanese history. He stood beside one of the most powerful men in Asia. For 1 year, the impossible became real. And that's worth remembering. But Yasuke isn't the only forgotten hero whose story defies everything we thought we knew about history. Because next time we're traveling to North America to uncover a truth that will fundamentally change how you understand American democracy itself. Before we conclude, let's explore some of the lingering mysteries and theories about Yasuke that historians are still debating today. While most historians believe Yasuke came from Mozambique or Ethiopia, there's actually very little definitive proof. Some scholars have argued he might have come from South Sudan, or even from East African coastal trading societies that had contact with Portuguese merchants. Why does this matter? Because different origins would imply different backgrounds. If Yasuke came from Ethiopia, he might have been Christian before arriving in Japan, which would explain his relatively easy relationship with the Jesuit missionaries. If he came from Mozambique, he was likely exposed to Portuguese culture during the slave trade, giving him some preparation for navigating colonial power structures. There's even a fringe theory that Yasuke might have had military training before becoming enslaved, that he was a warrior in Africa before becoming a warrior in Japan. It's speculative, but it would explain how quickly he adapted to samurai combat training. How did Yasuke communicate? We know he eventually learned Japanese, but how quickly and how much did he retain his original language? Historical records indicate that Nobunaga conversed with Yasuke extensively, which means they must have found a common language. Valeriano likely served as an interpreter initially, possibly translating through Portuguese, but within months, Yasuke seems to have been operating without constant translation. This suggests a remarkable linguistic ability. Learning Japanese with its complex writing systems and formal hierarchical language structures is difficult even today. Yasuke apparently mastered enough of it to function in a military and political environment within a year. Some historians have suggested that Yasuke might have been multilingual even before reaching Japan, having picked up Portuguese during his enslavement. This would have made learning Japanese easier, as he would already have been trained in linguistic adaptation. Here's a controversial question. Was Yasuke actually a skilled warrior, or was he more of a symbolic figure who occasionally fought? The historical record is frustratingly vague on this point. We know he carried weapons. We know he was present at battles. We know he fought at Honoji and Nijo Castle, but we don't have detailed accounts of his individual combat prowess. Some historians argue that Yasuke's primary value was symbolic, that Nobunaga enjoyed having such an unusual retainer as a demonstration of his own power and sophistication. They point out that Nobunaga had a tendency to collect rare and exotic things from European clocks to African warriors. Others argue that Nobunaga was too practical to keep anyone around who wasn't useful. If Yasuke had been merely decorative, he wouldn't have been given such a trusted position as weapons bearer and bodyguard. These positions required skill and reliability, not just novelty. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Yasuke was likely both symbolically valuable and genuinely competent. His physical advantages, height, strength, reach, would have made him formidable in close combat even with minimal training. And we know he received actual training from some of the best warriors in Japan. What was the actual nature of Yasuke's relationship with Nobunaga? Was it purely professional, or was there genuine friendship? Contemporary accounts suggest that Nobunaga genuinely liked Yasuke. He spent hours in conversation with him. He personally supervised his training. He brought him into his inner circle. These aren't things you do for a mere curiosity, but we have to be careful about romanticizing this relationship. Nobunaga lived in a rigidly hierarchical society where the idea of true equality between a daimyo and a retainer, much less a foreign one, would have been almost incomprehensible. Whatever affection existed, it was still filtered through massive power imbalances. Some scholars have speculated that Nobunaga saw Yasuke as a kind of living proof of his own vision for Japan, a person who succeeded based on merit rather than bloodline, who rose through ability rather than ancestry. Nobunaga was breaking down traditional power structures throughout his domain. Yasuke might have represented that philosophy incarnate. So what happened to Yasuke after he was released to the Jesuits? Let's examine the main theories. Theory 1. He returned to India or Africa. Some historians believe Yasuke might have traveled back west, possibly returning to Goa, a Portuguese colony in India, where many enslaved Africans were taken, or even attempting to return to Africa. The Jesuits maintained shipping routes throughout Asia and Africa. If Yasuke wanted to leave Japan, they could have facilitated it. The problem with this theory, there are no records of him in Portuguese colonial documents after 1582, and the Portuguese were meticulous record keepers, especially regarding unusual individuals who had achieved fame. Theory 2. He stayed in Japan as a Christian convert. Another possibility is that Yasuke remained in Japan, perhaps living quietly in one of the Jesuit communities that existed before Christianity was banned. He might have adopted a Japanese name, lived a humble life, and died without leaving any record. The problem with this theory, Yasuke was famous. Even if he tried to live quietly, people would have recognized him, and after Christianity was banned in the early 1600s, Christian communities were ruthlessly hunted down. Yasuke would have had to hide his identity completely, which seems unlikely given his distinctive appearance. Theory 3. He died shortly after Honnoji. Perhaps the simplest explanation, Yasuke might have died of wounds sustained during the battle or from disease or other causes shortly after his release. In an era with limited medicine, and in the chaos following Nobunaga's death, this wouldn't be surprising. The problem with this theory, the Jesuits would likely have recorded the death of such a notable figure. They recorded everything else about him. Theory 4. He became a Buddhist monk. This is a more intriguing possibility. In feudal Japan, many samurai who survived the defeat of their lords became monks as a way of honoring the dead and finding new purpose. Yasuke, having lost Nobunaga and Nobutada, might have done the same. Buddhist monasteries were places where outsiders could find acceptance, and physical appearance mattered less than spiritual commitment. If Yasuke became a monk and adopted a Buddhist name, he would effectively disappear from records that were looking for him under his samurai name. Theory 5. He served another lord. Finally, there's the possibility that another daimyo took Yasuke into service. He was trained, experienced, and unique. Those are valuable qualities in a retainer. Perhaps he found employment with someone else and lived out his life in service to a new master. The problem, again, no records. And after the chaos of Nobunaga's death, most surviving retainers were viewed with suspicion. The most frustrating part of all these theories is that we'll probably never know which, if any, is correct. Short of discovering new historical documents, which is always possible, but increasingly unlikely after 440 years, Yasuke's final chapter remains sealed in mystery. But that mystery is part of what makes his story so compelling. Because Yasuke represents something we all want to believe in, the possibility of radical transformation, of transcending the circumstances we're born into, of making ourselves into something new. So, what do we take away from the story of Yasuke? Maybe it's this. History is not fixed. It's not settled. Every generation rediscovers it, reinterprets it, finds new meaning in old stories. Yasuke was forgotten for centuries, dismissed as a curious footnote. But his story never stopped being true. It never stopped being remarkable. It just waited for people ready to listen. And his story challenges us. It challenges our assumptions about the past, about who gets to be a hero, about what's possible when circumstances align and courage meets opportunity. Yasuke was a slave who became a samurai. He was an African who became Japanese, or as Japanese as the rigid hierarchies of the time would allow. He stood beside legends. He fought in battles that changed history, and then he vanished, leaving behind just enough evidence to prove he existed and not enough to show us how his story ended. Maybe that's fitting, because the real power of Yasuke's story isn't in the ending. It's in the transformation itself. It's in the impossible year when a man who should have remained invisible became unforgettable. If you found this story fascinating, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what you think happened to Yasuke. Did he survive? Did he return home? Did he find peace? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know your theories. And if you want to keep exploring the forgotten corners of history, the people who changed the world, but whose names were erased from the textbooks, subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started. Next time in Forgotten Heroes, we're heading to North America to uncover one of the most important and overlooked influences on modern democracy. You think you know how the United States Constitution was created? Think again. Because the Founding Fathers had help from a source you've probably never heard of, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, their sophisticated system of government, helped shape American democracy in ways that will completely change how you understand the founding of the United States. That's Episode 3, The Native American Who Saved the Constitution. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, history belongs to those who tell it. For too long, stories like Yasuke's were left untold, buried under more important narratives about kings and emperors. But every forgotten hero reminds us that greatness isn't reserved for the people born into power. Sometimes it belongs to the people who were never supposed to matter at all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.